of Global Health Watch, the World Health Report, which is alternative to what WHO and other international organizations produce in this field. So I'm very pleased to give the floor to David. The title of his presentation is, as you see from the program, Riding Two Horses, the challenges of conducting academic research while also engaging politically. You have the floor. Good. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's been a long morning and full of such kind of rich information and thinking and ideas. So I hope I can kind of do justice, not just to what we heard this morning, but also for the whole of yesterday. When I came to Padua, I had this title about riding two horses. I had this very nice picture, and that was just about it, because I wasn't quite sure exactly what was going to be presented. There were so many amazing topics and speakers, and really I wanted to ensure that what I closed with would be something slightly different from what we've already heard, and I hope I've managed to do that. The idea of the two horses comes from the fact that, as you've just mentioned, for the last 5 years I've had two jobs. I've been the director of a global public health charity called MedAct, and I've also been an academic at Queen Mary University, London. And MedAct is an organization that essentially works to change the world, to make the world safer, fairer, and better. That's our mission statement. And the idea of MedAct is really to be an organization of health professionals who will engage with not the diseases that cause people to be sick, but the systemic pathologies, the structural, social, political pathologies that cause people to become ill and unwell. We have 4 programs, one around peace and security, one around climate change and the environment, one on economic justice, and one on human rights. Very broad, very ambitious, but we believe that the health community has the mandate and the kind of social power to have some effect on these big issues. And we also believe that these issues are all interconnected, that you can't talk about the problems of climate change without talking about economic justice, and we can't address the issues of violence and war without addressing issues related to human rights, for example. So I want to kind of draw on my experience over the last 5 years of kind of riding these two horses, of being an academic and being a person who works in a campaigning organization, an organization that exists to mobilize the health community. But specifically, I want to talk about academia more generally. I'm now actually a full-time academic. I've stopped being the director of MedAct as of 2 months ago, and I'm now only an academic, a full-time academic. And as I've become a full-time academic, I've been thinking about what does it mean to be an academic now that I'm no longer working in the non-government sector, no longer working for a public health charity. So that's what I want to do, not to just talk about the role of research, but more generally about the role of academics and the role of academia. Now, I think the idea of riding two horses from a kind of academic perspective is clear in the sense of anyone working in the social and political sciences or in the arts and the humanities, but particularly if you're working in public health and in human rights, you will intuitively or immediately feel that your academic work cannot in any way be apolitical. That whatever you're doing in that field, that you are probably building into your academic work some kind of social or political mission. In fact, Todd Landman yesterday talked about this distinction between the normative and the empirical, between the is and the ought. And we've heard today and yesterday about the use of research, not just to discover things or to find out about certain issues or to answer questions, but to change the world, to make things better. So I think all of us in this room would agree that we don't need to pretend that rigorous research is something that is somehow done by people or researchers who are amoral or apolitical. That it's legitimate to build a social or ethical mission into your research. And for me, I think I spent 10 years in South Africa working as a clinical doctor first, then as a public health physician. And obviously it's very clear. All the research we had showed that the predominant factors that influenced the pattern and distribution of disease was not predominantly viruses and bacteria, but it was really the social and political arrangements in that country. And you can take a whole bunch of public health literature that will describe, emphasize, and point to the social and political determinants of health as being fundamental. And these are two quotes from a WHO Commission on the Social Determinants of Health that was published in 2008. Nothing controversial here. Let's take three contemporary public health issues at the moment: the cholera crisis in Yemen, the impacts of extreme weather events all across the world, but most recently in the Caribbean, and the global obesity epidemic. And it would be, I think, hard, if not intellectually bankrupt, for anyone to argue that in studying the determinants of these three public health problems, you can or should be politically neutral when it comes to the sale of arms to an illegitimate and repugnant regime in Saudi Arabia, the active funding of climate denialism, including the corruption of science. And this has been beautifully described in a book called Merchants of Doubt, the way in which the fossil fuel industry and a variety of billionaires have actively sought to find ways of influencing scientific establishments, very similar to the way in which the tobacco industry were able to undermine all the science showing the link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. Nor would it be easy for anyone to feel that there should be some control over the way in which big food is pumping sugars and fats into our children. These are companies that are not so much too big to fail, like the banks of the 2008 financial crisis, but rather companies that are too big to control. Now, I put this slide up because I didn't want you to have to keep looking at the corporate logos of those big food companies. But while all of us in this room might agree with these kind of broad concepts about the relationship between science and politics and the kind of role of academia, not everyone in academia is comfortable with the idea that you can ride two horses. Not everyone likes the idea that academics should be riding two horses, being researchers and scientists at the one hand and social change agents on the other. It's as though there is an idea that you can't be trusted to conduct a rigorous randomized controlled trial of a particular form of cholera treatment if you also object to the arms trade that is fueling the conflict and war in Yemen. Or that you can't come up with a model of the likely effects of freshwater salination on blood pressure in Bangladesh due to sea level rise, if you're also campaigning for universities to divest from fossil fuel. As though you can't study the physical effects of sugar and fat on human metabolism if you also believe that big food companies need to be regulated, that we should be not advertising junk food to children on TV, and that we should be forcing companies to reduce the amount of sugar that they put into sugary drinks. there is a climate of self-censorship in much of academia, which tells academics that you should not be too political. Some of it, I think, is misguided. I mean, the self-censorship. There is actually, I think, a belief amongst some academics that you can be apolitical, that the failure to recognize that claiming or appearing to be politically neutral or ambivalent is, in fact, to be in favor of the status quo. But some of it is actively anti-political. There are deliberate attempts, I think, to try and depoliticize certain issues, or to try and ensure that certain inconvenient truths are left unspoken, or that some research questions are left uninvestigated. And certainly in my work, where I look at global health policy and I look at the institutions of global health governance, I found the work of Schedler to be very useful. He's come up with a typology of anti-politics. He describes the use of amoral anti-politics, where we shrink and privatize the public domain in order to reduce the space for political deliberation. There's an instrumental anti-politics, where we find ways to claim that political decisions are in fact technocratic decisions, that we claim that political decisions are in fact made not through political deliberation, but through the creation of rational, neutral, cost-benefit analyses. And I think fitted into this form of anti-politics is the evidence-based policy movement, this idea that policy can only be based on evidence, or should only be based on evidence. Not evidence-informed policy, but evidence-based policy, which completely misunderstands the fact that policy formulation is a social and political process as much as one that is informed by science and information. We have moral anti-politics, where we use ethics and normative principles to stifle democratic debate or disagreement and dissent. One example of this is the way in which critiques of international aid are often challenged, because on the grounds that critiquing international aid or critiquing corporate social responsibility will cause more harm than good. Instead of questioning the structure of international aid, instead of questioning the role of philanthropy as opposed to the role of proper tax systems, might be criticized for actually harming charity and harming philanthropy. And it kind of creates, again, another form of self-censorship, this type of moral anti-politics. And we have a form of aesthetic anti-politics, where we replace words with images, theater and drama as a way of trivializing issues and marking the triumph of the symbolic over deeper understanding and communication. Of course, we've had Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky who've described another form of anti-politics in terms of the manufacturing of consent by the mainstream media and how they help to create and support for, amongst other things, the American aggressive wars in Latin America and Southeast Asia, and also the kind of hyper-materialist and consumerist culture that is at the heart of all mainstream economies today. The acceptance of neoliberalism as an ideology with no alternative. This is all done to a large extent by the manufacturing of consent by the mainstream media. We've created an illusion that there is no alternative to arming the regime in Saudi Arabia. There is no alternative to continued dependence on fossil fuel, or the right of companies to market junk food to our children. Yesterday, we talked about the importance of evidence. Linda Hogan argued, and I would agree with her, that evidence is important, but perhaps ideas matter even more. And the ideas of neoliberalism are a number of the ideas that have been discussed today and certainly yesterday. How do we engage with this kind of neoliberal paradigm that we have been living in for the last 2 or 3 decades? But Perhaps as important as the ideas is politics. So the ideas of neoliberalism did not just emerge to become mainstream spontaneously, but they were very much parts of a political project to make them mainstream. They were very much parts of a 30 to 40-year political project to eradicate other alternative ideas and to make these ideas mainstream. And again, as we heard yesterday, researchers and academics face a new threat. There is now attempts to reject science altogether, and in many countries there are active attacks on academics and intellectuals. This is, of course, a recent trend, but one which follows, at least in the country that I work in the UK, a gradual weakening of academic independence over the years, caused partly by the marketization of the higher education sector. So we've seen neoliberalism impact on the academic sector and higher education. We've seen the growing corporatization of science, the increasing dependence on public-private partnerships to conduct research. And we've seen this introduction of a bureaucratic and authoritarian managerialism within academia, designed to performance manage academics according to a whole bunch of quantitative metrics that are often quite invalid. So I think there is a need to think about research and how it can be applied to human rights, but I think we should be also thinking about how we need to rescue academia and protect what remains of academic independence. So what is it to be an academic? Yes, it is to be a researcher. Yes, it is to be an expert. Yes, it is to be an intellectual. We are, after all, paid to read and to learn and to think, which is a really important function in society. And certainly if you look at the big challenges we face as a species, the big challenges we face as a global community, this inexorable increase in social and economic disparities, the growing inequalities, the concentration of power and wealth, not just in the 1%, but in the 0.1%, the de-democratization of life, climate change and ecological collapse, this rapid rise in new technologies and artificial intelligence and robots that will completely transform the labor market in the next 10, 15, 20 years. The upswing in violence that we've seen. For the first time over the last 8 years, we've seen an upswing in violence since the end of the Cold War. And the growing divisions that we see right across Europe. The potential breakdown in liberal democracy. We're seeing early signs of that. We're facing a whole bunch of existential crises. And surely there is a really important role for academics in addressing that. But beyond that, I think, beyond being researchers, experts, thinkers, problem solvers, intellectuals, we are citizens as well. And we need to recognize and see our role as social change agents, to be purveyors of normative values. Evidence matters, ideas matter, politics matter, but values matter too. A sense of solidarity, a sense of decency, a sense of compassion and empathy. These are all things that matter, and these are all things that I think we as an academic community should also be delivering. We should be leading from the front. We should be social change agents leading from the front because we are privileged and we have the opportunity to think, to read, to learn. But we should also be leading from the back and empowering and working with social movements. And again, another quote from the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, making the point that big changes, big leaps in social progress have always been accompanied by progressive social movements. academics and thinkers and intellectuals by themselves cannot be effective social change agents without working with and through much larger social movements. What else is it to be an academic? I pointed to a number of big challenges that we face as a global community, and I think we need to be global because many of these challenges are global. And we need to be thinking of ourselves as a global community and kind of forging global solidarity as academics. And I would like to think that, for example, every university in Western Europe is supporting this campaign to defend the academic freedom of academics in Turkey, where there is currently a purge of critical academics. And finally, I think, given all of this, given what we face, given the difficulties, the problems, particularly working in public health and in human rights, we need to be visionary, we need to be hopeful, and we need to be optimistic. We need to find ways of overcoming the politics of fear with a politics of hope. And once again, I think there is a role for academics in that. So we need to ride two horses. That's my feeling, but we also need to wear many hats. Researchers, scientists, parents, social movement catalyzers, and I think I'm going to stop there and say thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We have some minutes, actually, for conversation, to talk with David and maybe also talk among ourselves, starting from the wisdom that David has conveyed to us at the end of these 2 days, one day and a half. Anyone? 1, 2, the lady behind.
On. Thanks, David. Nothing like listening to a paper you 100% agree with. I just wanted to ask what you think about how you go about convincing perhaps public officials that riding two horses is acceptable. Because I was at the Lancashire fracking hearings when the MEDAC report on the public health impacts of fracking was presented by those who were against the applications. And unfortunately, the planning officer basically wrote 3 or 4 lines on an otherwise wonderful report that suggested that just because one of the authors was against it, it made the whole report invalid. So that whole process seemed to me that it was okay to ride 2 horses as an academic so long as one of them was paid for by a corporation. But that was a real problem because that whole piece of evidence was then dismissed because that public official acted like a filter. So I wonder how you get around such problems.
I don't know if you can get around those problems. Well, I think, no, let me answer it. I think that there are 2 things. One is to get around that problem by being very careful about who writes reports like that and making sure you don't include anyone that might be labeled as an activist. So that would be one tactical way of doing it. The other would be to challenge this notion that you can't be rigorous and scientifically independent and neutral and at the same time have a view and an opinion about an issue. And particularly on issues like public policy, once you've analyzed the evidence and you've formed a conclusion based on that analysis, you're really expected to come up with a position or a recommendation. And so it's a nonsense to suggest that you can be an expert on an issue like fracking, but not have a position on whether it should or shouldn't go ahead. And in fact, I was asked to be an independent expert reviewer of the health impact assessment that was conducted by the Scottish Department of Health. And we spent 2 weeks having a discussion as to whether or not I would be eligible to be an independent expert because I'd authored the MEDAC report. And in the end, they said they agreed that they would allow me to be an expert because I could just wear my Queen Mary hat on. But if I hadn't been attached to a university, I would have been denied that opportunity.
Yes, thank you. I wonder if you're not deluding yourself thinking that you're going to be able to let go of your advocacy for or your non-academic life, because it sounds like you're still part of the advocacy world, and I wonder if that's a good thing, actually. Because as an academic, you might find that advocacy actually helps inform your teaching even more and actually motivates the next generation of advocates.
No, I mean, I constantly delude myself, but on this issue, I'm not. I very much would describe myself as what am I now? And I used to be an academic activist. Now I'm an activist academic, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if riding two horses is the right kind of metaphor. I think it gives the idea that these are two separate horses. But in fact, part of what I've been arguing is that you can't separate a lot of the academic work from the kind of political and normative aspects to it. And in fact, they are one horse, or they should be one horse.
Thank you, David, for a lovely closing thoughts. And I wonder if it's not just about the two horses, but there's another enterprise that we haven't mentioned hardly at all, except for at the opening when the context of the conference and the Human Rights Center was explained, which is horse training. Which is education and teaching, which was, I think, at the heart of Mary's point there. And I wonder if you might say something about that, perhaps.
Yeah, I think maybe that's something that I missed out in my slide on what is it to be an academic, because I certainly see one of the most important roles of being an academic is the teaching role, and that is a role that has been diminished in recent times. I mean, I talked about the kind of bureaucratic managerialism that governs many academics. Much of that is directing academics more and more towards being seen as researchers and scientists rather than as educators. There are attempts, I think, to correct this imbalance that has kind of grown over the last few years. But I'm constantly amazed by the number of my colleagues who grumble and complain about having to teach. As though it was some kind of penance, and I think that's a cultural thing we need to change. It's such a wonderful thing to be able to do, and it's such a privilege to be able to kind of teach and explain things to young minds, and help them explore and understand the world that they live in. So I absolutely see that as being very important, and in my current job at Queen Mary, a lot of what I do is teaching. I've created and set up, and I'm growing a teaching program. And part of the mission is to teach and to grow academics that will think critically.
Good morning. Thank you for your lovely presentation. I was wondering whether your concept of being political as an academic is the traditional activistic one of producing social change and remaining, however, neutral among the different political forces, or rather to take side and choosing one political party or one political side over the other? And if is the second conception, how would you avoid to be called politically biased?
That's a really good question. I think it comes back to this image here about wearing different hats. I think I'm very, very careful about which hat I'm wearing and what I choose to say when I'm wearing that particular hat. I think it's important as an academic to, when you're speaking as an academic, to be careful about how you engage with politics. But there are times when you take off your academic hat off and you put on your hat of being a parent or being a citizen, and you should be able to think and act differently. Not always easy, but equally with the charitable work I do. MedAct is a charity, which also means that you have to be very careful about not being aligned to any particular political party, because that will undermine your charitable status. So I believe in people having multiple identities and wearing different hats and needing to behave differently according to which hat you're wearing.
Thank you, Richard, for a wonderful summary or summation of the key ideas. There is a bit of ambiguity in our current situation, though, because on the one hand, for example, if you think about the EU and the level of funding that is invested from the EU in addressing the global challenges and doing interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research, so that there's that. So never, we've never had as much research funding to be competed for. And on the other hand, there is this sort of great suspicion now of science and evidence. So there's a sort of a contradiction there in a way. And similarly, when you think about the way in which public engagement and impact is being really pushed very hard by universities and, research councils, etc. So that would give one to understand that there is indeed a genuine appreciation of the engaged forms of research, and yet we encounter, the opposite as well. So will you say something about how those different sort of contradictory strands are playing out, and where do you think the ultimate where does the center of gravity really lie?
I'm not sure. I mean, I see what you're saying. There are these contradictions, and there are these kind of positive developments that are running alongside what I would describe as being more negative developments. And we certainly need to kind of capitalize on those positive developments and magnify them if we can. Whether the positive will outweigh the negative, I don't know. But that's part of what I'm trying to say, is that we need to make sure that they do outweigh the more negative. And certainly the impact of Brexit on higher education in the UK, again, we don't know exactly how that will play out, but I certainly have kind of worries that it's going to make things worse rather than better in the UK, that is. I don't know, glass half full or glass half empty?
Thank you very much for your thoughts on this topic. At the Human Rights Consortium a few years ago, we started something called the Human Rights Researchers Network, with the aim of trying to bring together those who work on human rights research in the academy and those who work on it outside, like principally in NGOs, but also think tanks and governments. And there's lots of challenges in bringing together those two constituencies, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on one of them, which is, as researchers, when we're analyzing the social world and NGOs as activists in that, we often have a critical lens, and some of our findings are critical of those actors. And at the same time, we have a normative interest to support their project. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about how do you navigate that terrain between, maintaining an academic critical lens, which is an important part of our work, but also ensuring that those findings don't necessarily undermine the work of the partners that you have in the research.
Okay. If I understand your question, I think one way of ensuring that the kind of normative work doesn't undermine the academic work and vice versa is for some of the research that's done outside of the academic sector by NGOs to be published in the academic literature, to have the stamp of kind of academic peer review and the credibility of being peer reviewed. I don't know if that's partly answering your question, but I do think that the research that's being done outside of formal academic institutions is incredibly important. Not all of it is very rigorous, and some of it is kind of quick and dirty research that's kind of designed to kind of serve the function of an NGO like Amnesty. But some of it is rigorous, and some of it should be understood and described and accredited as being rigorous and of academic quality. And academics have an opportunity, I think, and possibly a responsibility of working with NGOs like Amnesty and helping to translate some of their research into peer-reviewed academic literature. Not enough of that is done, I don't think.
Hi, Dave. Excellent presentation. I wonder what are your thoughts about neoliberalism and how to move forward from the TINA mantra. And recently, the IMF published 3 reports. One saying that inequality is too high, and inequality must be reduced to promote financial wealth, security and stability around the world. 2, it published a report saying that austerity doesn't work. And 3, it published another report saying that neoliberalism has been oversold. And the IMF has been promoting neoliberalism, austerity policies, and indirectly promoting inequality for 40 years. Why there is such a renegade? It renegates itself 3 times, the gospel of neoliberalism. Do you think that this is a sign of hope for the future, a change of heart coming from an institution that championed neoliberalism? And if a crisis of 2008 can be an opportunity for social change and paradigms?
So can someone ask me a really hard question? I think after 2008, everyone thought that this was an opportunity to rethink the way in which economic globalization has been structured and governed and the kind of paradigm that's shaped it. And it didn't really happen. But I am struck by the fact that there is a growing, what I would call a new economics movement. There is a new movement, particularly amongst young people. And universities are talking much more about the need to kind of change the dominant economic paradigm that has governed economics as a discipline. And there is something called a new economics movement. So I see some hope in that. But I think the actual solutions to it are much more difficult because it's not just about technocratic solutions and coming up with new policies. It's really about all the other things that we've talked about. It's about values and overcoming the politics of fear and division and difference. It's addressing the whole climate change issue. How are we going to change the way we consume and behave? We are destroying the planet at the moment. So there are grounds for hope in the sense that people know that the current system is simply not working. It has to change. And there is a growing social movement, I think. That movement needs to be grown, but I don't think there isn't a kind of recipe book that we can apply to fix the problem. Which is why academics, I think, are really important to help navigate the complexity of what we're facing.
Okay, thanks first for the presentation. Actually, it's a question maybe not for Dr. David only, maybe for all researchers here in the whole. I want to ask what will be our role as researchers and activists of human rights in protecting human rights in an era or a time that we will see the greatest power that will going to dominate or control the international system. It will be far from respecting human rights. I mean, some states, actually maybe the first one is going to be China, for example. So what will going to be our role as researchers and activists if we're going to face some problems and a lot of challenges? So what will going to be our role? It's open questions for all of people here. Maybe going to... Thanks.
I mean, if I could just make one point about the term human rights, which is an important term and a term that I use, but one of the things that I feel is really important is to always connect that term with the notion of equity and social justice and democracy. And human rights by itself, I think, is not a powerful